Hello, Theodore shoebat here, giving you guys another message that the church is not telling you. Today we're going to be talking about the Emperor Constantine and Christian persecution. As we all know, when the Roman Empire was fully pagan and all the Caesars were pagan and worshipped as gods and all that, we all know that they were persecuting heavily the Christians. They butchered tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Christians when they were pagan, because the Christians refused to worship the Roman Caesar. And as we all know, Christianity is a religion that defies pagan tyranny. So as Moses defied the tyranny of the Pharaoh and the deification of the Pharaoh, so did the Christians as well defy the tyranny of the Caesar and the deification of the Caesar. That is why Jesus Christ says, "Lend unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and lend unto God what belongs to God," meaning, do not worship Caesar. That is a direct commandment from our Lord, that we are not to worship government, because it does not belong to government. Worship only belongs to God, and to God alone. So this was the primary reason for the persecutions. What ended the persecution in Rome? It really wasn't because there were a lot of martyrs. It wasn't because the Christians kept preaching and doing, I don't know, revival crusades like Billy Graham does today. The persecution toward the Christians, that is, ended as a result of military action on the part of the Emperor Constantine. That is the bottom line. The Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity thanks to a vision that he received and the interpretation of the vision by his Christian servants who were with him, his Christian councilmen who were with him. And they told him, he asked him, "What did you see?" And Constantine said, "Well, I saw a cross." And they said, "Well, that's the sign of Jesus Christ." He becomes a Christian. Not only that, but he also reads the laws of Moses, he reads the Old Testament, he reads the New Testament. He gets himself involved in deep study. And he defeats the tyrant Maxentius, who was butchering the Christians by the thousands, really, in the city of Rome, defeats him, takes the throne, and becomes the leader. Now, Constantine, in order to prevent the pagans from usurping the power ever again, does legislates a series of laws suppressing and limiting and prescribing the religion of paganism. And why is that important? It's important because in order to prevent pagan tyranny, you must suppress the religion from which the ideology of pagan tyranny arises. So therefore, how do you prevent Nazism from ever taking over the government? Well, you begin to suppress the ideology of Nazism. That is what the Germans have done. In fact, in Germany and in Austria, you get arrested and thrown into jail for denying the Holocaust. Why? Because the Germans and the Austrians never want to see their country or their countries ever ruled under a Nazi ideological government. So in order to prevent these types of governments from ruling, you first have to prevent or to suppress the ideology that promotes and that kindles these very dangerous and despotic sentiments. So, of course, Constantine, being a wise leader, he suppresses the pagan religions. I'm going to read you just a number of examples. I have here a book which is very helpful. It's called From Constantine to Julian. It is a series of primary accounts compiled on the Emperor Constantine. And one of them is called The Origin of Constantine, which is one of the oldest primary accounts on the Emperor himself. And it says here, which is a very interesting part, it talks about the battle between Constantine and his army and the pagan tyrant Maxentius and his army, and also the pagan tyrant Licinius. He defeated two tyrants, let's not forget. And so he defeated Licinius, and he says here, "Then Licinius staged a battle at Chrysopolis, greatly aided by the Goths, whom their ruler, Alisa, had brought. Constantine's force was victorious and destroyed 25,000 armed men of the other side." Also, it says here, he ordered Licinius to be killed. So Constantine had the tyrant Licinius put to death. Then it says here, although all the participants in the dreadful persecution were already dead, this man was also clearly asking for punishment. who had been a persecutor as far as he was able to. So he kills the persecutors, the pagan persecutors, and then he sets up a series of laws against the ideology, the pagan ideology, which these persecutors upheld. And it says here, Constantine made the change with due order and care. He issued an edict that the temples of the pagans should be closed without any loss of life. So he didn't really kill pagans, but nonetheless he destroyed their temples. So he didn't do a massacre, but nonetheless he suppressed the religion. So for those of you who ask me, Ted, how would you suppress false religions? How would you suppress dangerous religion? I would follow in a way similarly to what Constantine did, and that is to destroy their temples. And so that's why I agree with what Russia is doing. Russia is not exactly, they're not really killing Muslims, they're not butchering people like barbarians, but nonetheless, they are suppressing the religion of Islam, and that is what they're doing in Moscow. They only have 4 mosques in Moscow, and no more mosques can be built, but yet the Orthodox Church is allowed to build hundreds of mosques in the same city. This is what I call necessary suppression of dangerous religions. A necessary suppression, a reasonable suppression of these religions is what is needed in order to prevent their violent ideologies from taking any hold of influence in government and of jurisprudence and laws. The reason why we have abortion is because feminists influence the government. And those feminists, with their evil and wicked ideology, were allowed to influence the government with that same ideology. And that ideology, of course, was social Darwinism, and this idea, this very corrupt idea of female liberation, which was very pernicious and sanguinary in its nature. And that those ideologies should have never been allowed to influence any form of government. And that's the bottom line. Muslim Brotherhood infiltration in the White House, that is a result of religious liberty. And if simply these false and evil ideologies were suppressed and Christian law was implemented, these things would have never happened. There would be no 46 or 45 million babies aborted, and those are only the recorded ones. There would be no terrorist attacks. There would be some here and there, but nothing major. There would be no mass murders done. In fact, if Islam was suppressed from the very beginning and Muhammad was put to death as a damnable heretic, there would be no Armenian genocide, there would be no crusades, there would be no need for a crusade, there would be no Ottoman Empire, there would be no massacre of the millions of Armenians and Assyrian Christians, there would be no massacre of all the Christians in the Middle East. There would have been none of these things. And the same thing can be said for Nazism. If Hitler was arrested, put to death as a damnable heretic, which he was, and his ideology suppressed, there would be no Nazism. And whoever wants to sit here and tell me that the First Amendment of freedom of religion trumps everything, I ask them, I challenge them, in fact, to prove me wrong in what I'm saying right here, that if the Nazi ideology was suppressed from the beginning, then the Holocaust would have been prevented. If the Islamic religion was prevented from the beginning, all of the Islamic massacres would have never happened. If social Darwinism was suppressed and never allowed to influence government, abortion would have never happened. Eugenics would have never happened. None of these things would have ever happened. And so I am very much influenced by the Emperor Constantine. One last point I want to make right here is that it is very important to recognize that as soon as Christianity took control of the Roman government, that it began to suppress the religions that were its enemies. The enemies of Christianity, the religions that were the enemies of Christianity, paganism primarily, was suppressed. So if Christianity was supposed to be this religion that believed in freedom of religion and equality of all religions and all that nonsense, then how come in the year 312, just 312 years after Christ, how come as soon as it took over the government, as soon as it took over a government, it began to do wars on its enemies? That tells us something very innate and, I believe, something that a very unrecognized distinction within Christianity, and that is it is very militaristic. It is very bent on destroying its enemies, because it knows that if it doesn't destroy its enemies, those very enemies would destroy it. It destroyed the faith of Christianity. So this is my 2 cents, and this is my historical observation to you. And I hope you have enjoyed this message, and I hope you have learned something from this message. God bless.